incredibly tense 2 months between Canada and India. In September, when you get a cold, you become a completely different version of yourself. You'd usually spend your day marathoning game shows and soap operas, but here we are. Luckily, Advil Cold and Sinus helps relieve your cold symptoms so that you can get back to the real you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're stopping over in Dubai. Enjoy your time and
An incredibly tense 2 months between Canada and India. In September, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stood up in the House of Commons and said there were, quote, credible allegations the Indian government may have been involved in the killing of a Canadian Sikh leader, Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Back in June, Nijjar was murdered outside a Sikh temple in Surrey, BC. The 45-year-old had been labeled a terrorist by India, accusations he denied when he was alive. India has also vehemently denied the allegation it was involved in the murder, but so far has not cooperated with an investigation. In fact, following the allegations, India issued a travel warning to its citizens coming to Canada, stopped issuing visas to Canadians, and unilaterally removed immunity for dozens of Canadian diplomats, forcing them to leave India en masse. Some visa services, however, were restored this week. So where does the relationship between the two countries stand now, and why won't India cooperate with Canada in its investigation? India's High Commissioner to Canada, Sanjay Kumar Verma, joins me for his first TV interview since Prime Minister Trudeau made that allegation. Hello, High Commissioner. Pleasure to welcome you to our studios.
Thank you very much. It's such a lovely day.
I really appreciate you making the time. I want to start off, sir, with the latest news this week that India restored electronic visa services for Canadians. What should be interpreted from that?
When we suspended the e-visa services and other visa services as well, the main concern was our security and safety, and the security of not only myself in person, my consul generals and other consular staffs, other diplomatic staff. And we did a continuous evaluation of the situation, and during the last evaluation, we have come to a conclusion that now the security situation is relatively better than what it used to be when we suspended the visa services, and therefore we decided to resume e-visa services.
Should Canadians interpret at all from the decision that things between Canada and India, in terms of the relationship between the two countries, are improving?
There's a lot of conversation going on, a lot of dialogue between the two governments, and I feel that most of it is very constructive, and therefore I would say that yes, the relationship is better than what it was a couple of months back, and it's moving more towards more and more dialogue, and probably taking it to the next step.
The impression, I think, at the time of the suspension of those visa services among the public in Canada was that the decision was made as a retaliatory measure for the accusation that the Prime Minister levied against the Indian government. Can you respond to that?
Not really. If you look at the main concern which we have, and what is India's main concern in Canada, that some Canadian citizens are using Canadian soil to launch attack on sovereignty and territorial integrity of India, which is against any international law. India and Canada are both members of the United Nations. The United Nations Article 2.4 very clearly says, and the spirit is that no country should allow its soil to be used to target other countries' sovereignty and integrity, territorial integrity. So that is the core issue, which still remains there. But from this core issue, a lot of security concerns come up, and those security concerns are more current, and therefore they are being taken care of to some extent, and we feel relatively safer.
So I just want to be clear on that, and we'll get into that core concern that you outlined in a second, because I certainly do want to explore it. But the timing of all these decisions, for example, to kick diplomats out of India or remove their immunity so they effectively had to leave, to suspend the visa services, to issue a travel warning, all of that followed in succession right after the Prime Minister rose in the House of Commons on that day and levied the accusation. Are Canadians really to believe that none of that was in retaliation, that it's all just out of security concerns?
So on the retaliation side, of course, since one of our principal diplomats was expelled from here as persona non grata, so yes, we did retaliate on that. Any action will have reaction, and similarly we declared persona non grata one of the Canadian diplomats who was at the Canadian High Commission in New Delhi. Others are a process of evaluation. Since the emotions became very high once the statements were made from Ottawa, and a bit of emotional elements will be there when the decisions are taken. But again, the core concern remains there, and therefore we will keep talking to our interlocutors here to see what further can be done.
When it comes to the decision to remove immunity for the diplomats, what would it take to restore that? Is there any conversation taking place about that? Is there any possibility of those diplomats returning to India from where you said?
If I look at the Vienna Convention of Diplomatic Relations, there is a particular article which is known as Article 11 for those who are in the international law. That article very clearly states that if there is no specific agreement, then the receiving state can decide the size of the mission, the purpose of the mission. At the moment, there is no specific agreement between India and Canada. Some countries have. So we would look at more dialogue and see how we can facilitate better diplomatic presence of Canada in India and better Indian diplomatic presence in Canada.
But to be clear, the decision to remove their immunity was because of high emotions? And is that really a rational approach given the significance of our two countries' relationship and the number of citizens affected on both sides?
Not only. What I said was that emotional element was also a factor. But if I can go beyond what I have said, we have about 13 Indian diplomats in Canada altogether.
We're not going to be here forever, right? Makes me want to make some changes, maybe a big one.
Your family can't take much more.
In your life, you're doing this?
Never really a good time to stir the pot.
Others are either administrative staff or they are consular agents. We have two non-resident diplomats who live in Washington. They are defense services people but accredited to Canada. So even if I take at the maximum level, we have 15 of us. Canada has 60 plus. So therefore, there has to be some kind of a resemblance.
Why? Why was that not a concern prior to September?
Because the events which unfolded after the statements were made, we did not feel it was very friendly.
So may I ask then, short of a resolution on those elements, is there no possibility of the number of diplomats from Canada and India increasing until there is resolve on that matter?
I won't say that because that matter was still there when Canada had a larger number of diplomats in India. So it all depends on how the diplomatic conversation continues, how our concerns are understood in Canada, how Canadian concerns are understood in India. So it will be a package wherein we will have to have mutual respect for each other and then find a solution which will be beneficial for both of us.
And you do feel like there is a path there?
There is a path there, of course.
Okay, let's get into those concerns that India has expressed, but also I would like to begin with the concerns that Canada has. And High Commissioner, I'd like to ask you very bluntly, the accusation from the Prime Minister is that the government you represent is culpable to some degree in the assassination of Mr. Nijjar, the murder of Mr. Nijjar. Was the Indian government a part of any of that, in any capacity?
Absolutely not. Decidedly not. And what we have said at that time as well, that this is motivated an absurd allegation, and this is still allegation. Whether we would call it credible allegation, that's choice of word, but it's an allegation. So from the Indian government side, I can assure you and your viewers that there was no government hand in the shooting of a Canadian citizen on the Canadian soil, as it is always called. We are the country of rule of law, and all the freedoms and everything has been given in the Indian Constitution, which was well before which was in 1950 when we adopted our Constitution. So they are our pillars. We will not go beyond that. So, therefore, what I feel is that the space which is available on some pretext or the other to these elements needs to be evaluated.
I would like to ask you though, Mr. High Commissioner, if in fact India has no role in any of this, why is your government not cooperating in the investigation?
So there are 2 points on that. One is that even without investigation being concluded, India was convicted. Is that a rule of law? There should have...
The allegation was raised. How was India convicted?
Because India was asked to cooperate. And if you look at the typical the criminal terminology, when someone asks to cooperate, which means that you have already been convicted and you better cooperate. So we took it in a very different interpretation. But we always said that if there is anything specific and relevant and communicated to us, we will look into it. And that had been said from day one. So we have never said, of course we have not used the word cooperate, because we feel that that's humiliating. But we have always said that give us something specific and relevant, and we look into it.
So the National Security Advisor, for example, for this country was in India for a total of 9 days, I believe, over August and September. Are you telling me that no specificity was shared with the Indian government by the National Security Advisor, that not a single specific allegation was presented to the Indian government and asked for cooperation?
So conversations took place, but we needed something specific and relevant to go back to our law or legal authorities to seek permission to do investigation that we would have wanted to do. So till the time that those kinds of inputs are not there, in a country of rule of law, it will not be possible for us to move forward on the investigations.
But I see what you're saying about cooperation and the ask for cooperation, but I'm also thinking of criminal trials that take place here, for example, when something has been alleged and nobody has been convicted. The person who is accused has to cooperate in some way with the legal proceedings that take place, right? It's not necessarily a de facto conviction. It's just asking for, a very serious allegation to be taken as such, and India to do all it can, if in fact, as you claim, the government is completely innocent of any of the accusations, to do all that it can to prove that.
Absolutely. We have never said no. What all we are asking is give us something specific and relevant to move ahead. Unless that is there, what do I follow up with?
Well, I just have a hard time believing that our national security advisor, the top security official in this country, would go to your country for 9 days.
Thank you.
And not
For 12, right?
Here's what we know. Here's what we think happened. Can you please substantiate this one way or the other?
Listen, till the time it is not specific or relevant to the case, we will not be able to respond to it. There could be a lot of conversation. Conversations could have allegations. Conversation could have some facts of the case. But allegations and facts do not make it specific and relevant. So we need to have those facts. And we are always ready to do that. If you look at the most recent incident where there is some allegations put out in one of the newspapers against India, so let me also talk about that.
Yes, I'll ask you.
So US did provide us inputs. And we have already started following up on that. And those inputs were,
I'm sorry. I was going to ask, what are they so that I can
those
contrast
inputs are nexus between gangsters, drug peddlers, terrorists, and gun runners in the US. And there is a belief that some of the Indian connections, now when I say Indian connections, it's not the government of India connections. India is 1.4 billion people. So some of the Indian connections are there. We are ready to investigate because we have got inputs which are legally presentable.
Can you explain what you mean? I guess I'm curious what that means compared to what you're saying Canada has not presented. So what are inputs? Are they documents, for example, that they've presented you, intelligence that they shared with you, and are you saying that Canada has not done anything similar?
See, I don't oversee India-US relations. My mandate is India-Canada. So I'll not be able to go in depth in that. But what I'm telling you is from the statement which has been issued from India. And if I read this statement which is in front of me, during the course of recent discussions on India-US security cooperation, the US side shared some inputs pertaining to nexus between organized criminals, gun runners, terrorists, and others. The inputs are a cause of concern for both countries, and they decided to take necessary follow-up action. On its part, India takes such inputs seriously since it impinges on our own national security interests as well. Issues in the context of US inputs are already being examined by relevant departments in India.
The accusation that you're referencing there, the statement, I just want to make sure our viewers understand that there was a report this week from the London-based Financial Times newspaper, a separate report kind of confirming it in the Associated Press, which cited unnamed officials who said U.S. authorities had stopped a conspiracy to assassinate 6 separatists, Gurapwant Singh Panan, a dual Canada-U.S. citizen. The Financial Times also said that the U.S. Thwarted the plot to kill that individual, who was a lawyer in New York, who's among the organizers of a symbolic referendum on Sikh separation, and was a personal friend, actually, of Mr. Nijjar here in Canada. The newspaper said that the U.S. authorities had filed criminal charges related to the matter, and India was investigating. Are you saying, can I take from that, that it is the filing of the charges that separates this, because there have not yet been charges filed in Canada, that prompted different action from India, and that is informing the Indian decision not to cooperate in Canada?
See, one is that investigation in case of the US, as far as I know and understand, because again, I don't oversee India-US relations, is at much advanced stage, and therefore I presume that there would be better information shared with India.
And so once again, just for the record, I want to make sure you're saying none of that information, no intelligence, no evidence, nothing underlying the very serious accusation the Prime Minister, I don't think, would have made unless he thought the allegations were credible. None of that has been presented to the Indian government.
So I'll again repeat my position that there is no specific or relevant information for us to look into.
Okay, on that note, High Commissioner, I'll leave it there. I appreciate your time today very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Michael Oren is former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. and a former member of the Knesset. Ambassador Oren, thank you for being here this morning.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Lots going on today. I want to start, if I can, with this decision by Prime Minister Netanyahu to visit Gaza with the troops. What do you make of that decision to do that during a truce?
Well, I think it's important that an Israeli leader would go and visit the troops at the front line. I think that's true in any country in a war, certainly a war that is essential for our national survival. I think probably politically it's important for Mr. Netanyahu because there's a tremendous amount of criticism of him. His poll numbers are, how should I say this, rather abysmal. So, it's important for him politically to shore himself up. Israel is a country, it's not like, say, the United States where there's a commander-in-chief who's the president. The commander-in-chief of the Israel Defense Force is actually the government. And Israel goes to war on a consensual basis. You have to have a tremendous amount of legitimacy in the government in order to send the army, which is a citizens' army, off to fight. So the legitimacy of the Prime Minister, the person who heads that coalition, is extremely important for our ability to fight.
So we are now into day 3 of this truce, Ambassador Oren. It seems as though another group of hostages has been released. How do you feel about how this is unfolding? There was that blip yesterday with some of the aid not getting through, but Egypt intervened and it went ahead. How do you feel about how the truce is unfolding?
I think I probably speak for the vast majority of Israelis in saying that our feelings are mixed, quite naturally mixed. On one hand, we're delighted that these hostages are reunited with their families, and we hope for the further release of hostages, not just the 50 that are scheduled, but for all of the hostages to be reunited with their families. On the other hand, we understand we're dealing with Hamas. It's a terrorist organization. It's not an honest negotiator. It's not going to negotiate in good faith. It's always going to sort of move those goalposts whenever it can. That's the blip you were talking about. And we'll try to, always try to take advantage of Hamas Hamas conducts terror not just physically, but also conducts terror emotionally. Imagine what these parents and family members went through yesterday. It will divide family members. It will free a child, but not the mother. And that's sort of emotional terrorism. The idea at the end of the day for Hamas, and this we have to keep in mind as part of the ambivalence, is that Hamas wants a ceasefire. It wants a permanent ceasefire, not a temporary ceasefire. A ceasefire for Hamas means it wins. It means it gets away with mass murder. It means it reorganizes itself and prepares to launch the next attack, which is precisely what its leaders said it's going to do. They're not hiding that intention. And so we have this very difficult, almost impossible task of doing two things at the same time, releasing the hostages and destroying Hamas. Where Hamas won't release all the hostages, of course, because once it does that, we'll be able to, for example, flood those tunnels, the 300 miles of tunnels under Gaza, and finish off Hamas. So it's extremely delicate, sort of painful balancing act that Israel has to do, all the while resisting international pressure, and I would say growing international pressure, to give Hamas that permanent ceasefire.
We are just getting word. Well, CNN is reporting, Ambassador, that the 4-year-old Israeli-American Abigail, who was mentioned by President Biden on Friday, has been released. What does that indicate to you? That the idea that they, I mean, obviously she's a child, so that was part of the intention to release. But the fact that she is also American, I would imagine, would be significant for the Biden administration.
It is very. First, I want to say I know that family very well, old family friends, and I'm moved and delighted. Okay, if I sound a little choked up, I'm very moved and delighted. It's important for the president. The president has gone out on a limb here. He's gone out on a limb generally for Israel, and is paying a political price for it. His numbers are collapsing among especially young Democratic voters who disapprove of his handling of this, but he has remained absolutely steadfast in opposing these calls for a permanent ceasefire. He understands that would basically be a victory for Hamas and perhaps even the end of Israel. He understands that. But he's trying to also gain some credit, and he went out on the limb and helped him to negotiate this hostage release. And he hadn't really received any quid pro quo from it from Hamas, which is precisely was, again, Hamas's goal. It's not just a physical terrorist, it's also a diplomatic terrorist. It's trying to drive a wedge between Israel and the United States. It was doing that by not releasing any of the Americans. So now Hamas gets a good headline by releasing Abigail. That's the price of this hostage deal. But I think it also maybe gives a little bit of help to Joe Biden, who has really paid a political price for standing by Israel.
Do you think that this truce could go longer? Obviously, that is part of the deal. If hostages continue to be released, Israel will not strike back. Do you think that it could go longer? And would that be ultimately a good thing, the beginning of something that would stop the conflict?
Well, let's play it out to the end. Israel's offered an extra day of ceasefire for every 10 hostages released. And they are equivalent. We'll have been on the end of the ceasefire, about 170 hostages still in captivity in Gaza. So you can say how many days of a ceasefire that's going to amount to. Say just over 2 weeks of a ceasefire, which Hamas is going to want to play out. But at the end of the day, Hamas is not going to give up all the hostages. Again, the hostages are going to be their get out of Gaza free card. And even if they give up the last, even if there were a permanent ceasefire and all the hostages released, Israel would still have to continue this fight against Hamas. And I'll explain. It's not very complicated. We have about 250,000 internal refugees in Israel. People have been forced out of their homes because they cannot go back to the border communities because of Hamas. As Hamas just reconstitutes itself and prepares to launch the next strike, large swaths of Israel will become uninhabitable. We have no tourism right now, almost no foreign investment. Hamas will have basically won and maybe even pose an existential threat to the state. I honestly, personally don't know how we survive this if Hamas is continuing to rule Gaza. And so even in the best of all worlds, Hamas would release all the hostages and we would offer them a deal, and I'm saying this, I'm not an ambassador anymore, this is my personal opinion. We would offer similar to the deal that we offered the PLO in Beirut in 1982, which is get on a boat, go somewhere, go to someplace horrible like Libya or Algeria and give us all the hostages, we'll let you go for free. We won't sink the boat. And that would be probably the best outcome anybody could hope for. It's too early to tell whether that outcome is in any way possible.
Do you think that the release of the hostages changes what's going on inside Israel? Because obviously there was an enormous amount of pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to do more here. People were very fed up. I think that's fair to say. Does it change the way the people inside Israel respond to what's happening?
Yes, it does. It's an excellent question because Hamas, they may be evil, but they're not stupid. And here they've created a precedent of Israel agreeing to a ceasefire. It'll be difficult, not impossible, but difficult for Israel to resume the fighting after these 5 days, but also within Israel. Hamas has succeeded in putting wedges within Israel itself. So keep in mind, say 50 hostages get out, but there's 170 remain. Those families are going to go to the government and say, wait a minute, you only agreed to a ceasefire to get those hostages out. Agree to more ceasefires to get that out. So it's creating a wedge within Israel itself. My training is as an historian, and looking back through history, I can't find another example of a country that had to make these type of decisions. They're just excruciating all the time. And there's no good decision. There's only a less catastrophic decision, literally. And, we'll be writing about this for many, many decades to come. Right now, there's no good outcome. There's only a less agonizing and terrible outcome.
Lysol laundry disinfectant eliminates germs detergents leave behind. Lysol, what it takes to protect.
A special network active on the soil of Western powers run by Chinese embassies and consulates.
Its purpose is to allow overseas Chinese act as informants for the Chinese Communist Party.
What we know about the network of so-called consular volunteers. Child pneumonia cases surging through China. Beijing says everything is fine, but can the message be trusted? We spoke to an expert. Despite the rising health concerns, the communist regime will soon grant citizens from 6 countries free entry to China, no visa required. Find out who's on the list. And for your Black Friday shopping, watch out. Authorities say counterfeits are running rampant and up to 80% come from China. What do you think? Let us know below and subscribe if you haven't already. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. A network of Chinese volunteers acting as eyes for Beijing in the West. And according to a report from human rights organization Safeguard Defenders, its operation spans 5 continents, including the U.S. Worth noting, the network is separate from the overseas Chinese police stations we recently reported on. Instead, these are volunteers for Chinese embassies and consulates. Chinese embassies and consulates have been running a global network of volunteers for at least a decade. Experts say they can act as quasi-spies.
Its purpose is to allow overseas Chinese act as informants for the Chinese Communist Party. It could make local Chinese residents feel threatened, and it's posing a huge threat to the society.
And it seems most host nations are unaware of the networks on their home turf. The Safeguard Defenders report noted that on the surface, these volunteers handle administrative tasks like sending advisories to Chinese citizens living overseas. But the concern is that they could help Beijing control overseas Chinese communities. Many Chinese spy cases in the U.S. have been linked to these communities. Another report is also shedding light on the issue, put out by the UK Parliament's House of Commons Intelligence and Security Committee. It says Beijing is also deeply interested in the political views of Chinese diaspora overseas, at times encouraging or coercing them to align with the Chinese regime's interests. A Chinese minister counselor for Italy has said she hopes all consular volunteers will keep the, quote, motherland in mind and build an overseas Chinese security system. So where are these networks based? The report said they can be found in dozens of countries across 5 continents, from the US to the UK, Japan, Italy, France, and Chile. These networks are reportedly linked to the Office of Overseas Chinese Affairs. Canada described the office as an espionage operation last year. An undiagnosed strain of child pneumonia is rapidly spreading across China. Reports say many kids have developed severe symptoms and that at least one has died. Beijing said no unusual pathogens had been found in the country after the World Health Organization requested information. According to China, the infection wave was an outbreak of Mycoplasma pneumonia. But is this information trustworthy?
Mycoplasma pneumonia is a common respiratory infection and is self-limiting in the past. It's rarely caused severe lung infections. Usually it's restricted at the upper respiratory tract, and it's very rare to have any white lung situations.
The condition microbiologist Sean Lin is referring to, called white lung, doesn't mean a patient's lungs turn white. Instead, the lungs appear white on CT scans, indicating infection and fluid in the lungs. Many COVID-19 patients in China developed the symptom during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, it's making a large-scale reappearance in Beijing. One resident there told us about what he's seen. To protect his identity, we distorted his voice.
Basically, all the sick children I know have white lungs. This is a fact. I went to a friend's place last week. He spent 2,000 to 3,000 yen to treat his child. The CT scan showed the child has white lungs. It's quite scary.
The latest outbreak first hit China in September. Patients, mostly kids, are now flooding hospitals in major cities. One hospital in Tianjin City reportedly saw 13 times its average number of patients in a single day. Along with a white lung symptom, patients are also reporting high fevers lasting for days and coughing lasting about a month. Some infected children are being hospitalized, sent to the ICU, or treated with a complicated procedure to cleanse the lungs.
This cannot simply be explained by Mycoplasma pneumonia infection, and so I don't think the Chinese government is telling the world the true situations.
Taiwanese authorities are watching the situation closely from across the strait. Back in late 2019, weeks before China announced the COVID-19 outbreak, Taiwan warned the WHO about an unidentified virus spreading in China. At the time, the WHO didn't respond. Despite the unexplained pneumonia spreading inside China, the communist regime is looking to boost foreign tourism. Starting in December, for 1 year, citizens from 6 countries will be able to enter China without a visa, provided they're in the country for business, to visit relatives, and their stay doesn't exceed 15 days. Those 6 countries are France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, and Malaysia. China has been taking steps to revive its tourism sector following 3 years of strict COVID-19 rules. China's wait isn't quite over for a new AI chip made by U.S. chipmaker NVIDIA. 2 sources familiar with the matter say that's the message the company delivered to Chinese customers. Under strict U.S. export rules, NVIDIA is banned from shipping certain products to the country, including advanced AI chips. Since then, the company has turned to new chip designs to evade the curbs legally. Here's a closer look.
The semiconductor, known as the H20, is designed to comply with US export rules and is the most powerful of 3 chips NVIDIA has developed specifically for China. The firm was expected to launch its new products as early as this month, but sources say that's now pushed back to the first quarter of next year. They were told the H20 was delayed due to issues server manufacturers were having in integrating it. NVIDIA plans 2 other chips to comply with new US export rules, the L20 and L2. The sources said the L20 faced no delays, but were unable to share information on the L2. Now the delays mean NVIDIA could struggle to preserve market share against local rivals like Huawei. The US firm has bet on the chips to keep its market share in China.
More tech companies are saying goodbye to the Chinese market. This time, it's British chip designer Graphcore, considered a rival to American software company NVIDIA. It's most known for developing chips for artificial intelligence. The startup announced it would stop selling its products in China and plans to lay off most of its staff in the country. A spokesperson explained the decision follows strict U.S. rules, limiting high-tech chips from being exported to China. That's over concerns that the AI software they power would aid Beijing's military development. The company was touted as one of the UK's highest potential startups in 2020. But by 2022, revenue had plunged. Graphcore later revealed it would have to raise funding to avoid shutdown. Black Friday shoppers beware, counterfeit products are on the loose and they're coming from China. Officials from the Customs and Border Protection and Homeland Security investigations are warning of customer safety risks and major losses for U.S. businesses. At a Wednesday press conference, authorities displayed a recent seizure from New York. It included knockoff items like handbags, shoes, watches, and sunglasses, many branded with high-end logos: Louis Vuitton, Burberry, Chanel, Christian Dior, and Fendi. Other counterfeits include toys, bicycle helmets, makeup, iPhones, and even fake Oscar statues. The director of the CBP's New York office told NTD that between 70 and 80% of the goods come from China and Hong Kong, adding that U.S. authorities seize over 25 million of the fakes every year. Officials also point to the dangers of counterfeit products, like fake prescription medicines laced with unregulated, possibly lethal ingredients, or knockoff kids' toys made with toxic substances or heavy metals. Besides personal harm, authorities say they divert revenue from legitimate businesses, cause job losses, and fund criminal organizations. An official with Homeland Security investigations offered a golden rule for bargain shopping. If the deal seems too good to be true, it probably is. An update on Taiwan's presidential election. The founder of major Apple supplier Foxconn just dropped out of the race. His company says it's been targeted by Beijing ever since he launched his bid. What's happening behind the scenes? Let's take a look.
Foxconn is the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer. The Taiwanese company is closely linked to both the US and China, and both countries rely on its products. Most of Foxconn's factories are based in China, and the US is now trying to lure the company to the States. Semiconductor manufacturing is among the main reasons why the US views Taiwan as strategically significant, and is working to deter a potential Chinese invasion. Just after Foxconn founder Terry Gou announced his decision to run for president of the island, Beijing opened a tax probe into his company. The move prompted widespread suspicion. Another presidential candidate from Taiwan urged China to clarify what its tax investigation is really about. An expert from Taiwan told us that he believes Beijing's probe ties into politics.
China claims to be a world power. Regarding a matter such as this one, it should come out and explain itself. Are they specifically targeting Foxconn, or are they generally investigating certain companies? The Chinese Communist Party wants Guo to withdraw from the election, or they want him to accept their integration arrangement with mainland China.
Gou dropped out of the race on Friday. Taiwan's presidential election is set for January 13th.
An Australian warship sailing through the Taiwan Strait on Thursday. The sensitive waterway separates Taiwan from mainland China. Both Taiwan and Australia confirmed the deployment. The action comes as China and Australia work to get diplomatic and trade ties back on track. Beijing sees Taiwan as part of its territory and has vowed to take control of it by force. Taiwan staunchly denies Chinese sovereignty and has never been ruled by the communist regime. Is China growing a cyber army? One German newspaper reports that Beijing is massively expanding its cyber attack capabilities. The paper cited a study from Merci, a German think tank focused on China. The study says China's state-backed hackers receive training at the National Cybersecurity Center in Wuhan. The goals of Chinese cyber attacks differ from Russia's short-term sabotage operations. According to the study, Chinese attacks in Europe are often long-term. The goal is to stay in the systems for as long as possible, access data, and prepare acts of sabotage. The approach makes such attacks harder to detect. One German report says 43% of businesses hacked in 2022 identified at least one attack from China, compared to 30% in 2021. New Zealand's new government sending a clear message to the Chinese Communist Party. Watch.
New Zealand inked a deal to form a three-party coalition government on Friday. Prime Minister-elect Christopher Luxon with leaders from two other parties, David Seymour and Winston Peters. Peters will serve as foreign minister. When asked about China's growing influence, he compared the relationship between China and New Zealand to that between New Zealand and Niue, a small island country in South Pacific. He said size doesn't matter, respect does. That's all we ask for.
After more than 9 years, court hearings related to Flight MH370 are set to begin in Beijing next Monday. They will involve the victims' family members, Malaysia Airlines, Boeing, and other companies. Flight MH370 disappeared in 2014 while traveling from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. It carried 239 people on board. The plane's disappearance remains one of the most prominent aviation mysteries in history. Approximately 2/3 of the passengers were from China. In 2018, investigators released a report suggesting the plane's controls were intentionally manipulated to divert it from its course. They were unable to determine who was responsible. Family members of the victims continue to advocate for the resumption of the search, citing the discovery of debris. More than 30 suspected debris fragments have been collected from different locations worldwide, but only 3 wing fragments found along the Indian Ocean coast have been verified to belong to MH370. Ablaze in Myanmar Friday, a convoy of trucks there had been bringing goods from China into the country when the vehicles went up in flames. The incident comes amid rising concerns in China about border security. China's ambassador to Myanmar met with top officials there for talks about border stability. Myanmar's military has already lost control of several towns and military outposts in the country. It's now grappling with the biggest coordinated offensive since seizing power in 2021. That's all for today's China in Focus on YouTube. We're now sharing a shortened version of our program here after being demonetized for more than 2 years. Last month, YouTube removed our demonetization status, but reimposed it within days. If you'd like to support us, subscribe to our partner platform, Epic TV, where you can watch our full episodes or consider donating. Find us at donorbox.org/China-in-focus. Here's what to look out for in our second half. Chinese wealth manager Zhongzi's $31 billion problem is shaking investor confidence. The shadow bank also holds investment in Chinese real estate giant Evergrande, the world's most indebted developer. Are the financial troubles signaling broader economic fallout for China?
Bless you.
Publisher of the journal Political Risk joins us for insight. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. See you soon.
We're now joined by Ophir Falk. He's a We're now joined by Ophir.
Everyone just calls me. Let's break.
Time to head to Mohawk Casino, where pushing buttons is way more fun.
No, they're in the fridge. I just gotta finish something before. Thank you.
very own billboard. It just talks about how tasty you are. Where's the crust, brother?
Oh, there you are. See?
Oh, good. New Uncrustables. Find it in the freezer aisle.
Wow.
I know a place that will break you into 1,000 pieces. Stay away from them. Stay away from Lorca, Paco, and Picasso. Don't ask about Lola. I, the Playa Grande. I, Lord Nieve. But in spite of everything, it occurs to you to visit Andalusia. Don't say I didn't warn you. Be careful of the Andalusian crust.
I was also at the bar in '93, and that's why I'm here. I'm here to protect the people. You know what I'm trying to say? There's a lot of repercussions. Everybody's afraid to talk because there's repercussions. But if you say, I want peace, all of a sudden you're anti-Semitic. I'm not anti-Semitic. All the people I work with, I love them. So I'm not anti-Semitic. I want to put your children in the right. The children, you know, like Emily Hand, this little kid held, and also see these children bombed in the rubble. So, you know, this is my issue. All right, so everybody wants to have issue with it. I don't know what the answer is. But I know what the answer is. When you dial 911, I never, when I got to 911, I didn't ask for, are you this or you that? I did what I had to do. The man was like, I tried to save their life. And I'm going to tell you one thing, if you don't save their lives, they haunt you. They can't stay with you forever. So that's all I have to say.
Everything, we have to speak about that. That's all we have to do. Like, that's our job. That's our job to do that. That's all I have to say. Like, people are getting tortured. People are getting tortured all the way from. People are getting black. I saw this post this morning. 10 people they're naked, they're being tortured, and kids are being tortured. No food, no nothing, no water.
Fiscal outlook fallout. The Feds continue to face questions over their recently released fall economic statement, in which the Liberals had promised a degree of fiscal restraint to help rein in inflation and to help Canadians weather the cost of living crisis. So, did they succeed, and does the update pack a political punch? The scrum is the Ottawa bureau chief for La Presse, and Jude Almalis reports on the economy for the Canadian press. Hi to both of you. Great to have you here. I appreciate it. JD, I'm going to start with you. They have telegraphed that this would be pared down.
Yep.
Did that impact at all, from your perspective, the political punch, I guess, as I said in the introduction of the document?
I think so, because they were telegraphing some of the measures that would be contained in that economic update, and the political ally of the Liberals is the NDP in the House of Commons, and they were told to be more patient, and I guess more will be coming down in the federal budget probably next spring. But I would see this economic statement, because it is a real traditional economic statement, it's not a mini budget, as a turning point, I think, in the political discussions about the need to restrain spending. Because for the first time next year, we'll be spending more on interest rate payments than on transfer payments to the provinces. And that, I think, sends a clear signal to Canadians that it's time to worry about the management of the federal purse in Ottawa, which was not, I think, as big a concern in the past. I think now this marks a turning point, because interest payments are beginning to be a big problem. I think, in fact, will be the biggest item in the budget as of now.
That's a really interesting point. I think it's kind of, the restraint aspect of all this was the substance of the majority of my interview with the finance minister today, Najib. Do you think that politically it matters to this government to appear restrained, especially in contrast to what they've been in previous, as JD points out, in previous either economic statements or budgets?
Well, I think they clearly think that. I mean, if you look at right now, inflation being high still, interest rates still high, those are really the biggest problems for this government right now. Housing is obviously a big problem, but they know they can't fix it in one day. The best thing that could happen to them is for interest rates to come down, and some forecasts say maybe that could happen as soon as April. So you see the messaging around the fall economic statement that this is their primary goal. You see that they managed to keep the deficit the same this year as compared to the projection in the spring. There is some new spending, but if you look at the $21 billion that they added since the budget, the majority of that was announced before the fall economic statement. A lot of it was these EV battery plants that they were giving subsidies to. There wasn't much that was new. There's a few housing measures, but this was an opportunity for them to be able to temper spending, and they have a pretty good reason for it. They've been asked by the Bank of Canada to make sure fiscal policy is in line with monetary policy. And I mean, the good news for them was that the governor came out a couple days ago and said, he came out this week and said, he's happy to see the deficits are not rising in the short run for this year and next year, and that the government is introducing these kinds of new rules to limit spending. So in that sense, that element is a win for the government. Part of the majority, I would say, of the questioning back and forth with the finance minister, dedie, was around just that, how wedded they are to those promises. Because I think from the perspective of a lot of people who are watching today, Tiff Macklem might say, okay, this is all right now, but they aren't used to this idea or this kind of messaging from the government. Do you think they will be able to land the message among a wider swath of Canadians?
I doubt it, because in the past, I would say that their targets was a moving targets. It used to be, the ratio of the debt to the GDP. It would be a modest deficit of $10 billion. It was, put aside for more spending. Yes, COVID happened, and that's an undeniable burden on the federal purse. But since then, they've announced spending, very much a lot of spending. That brings up, questions about their seriousness about reaching any targets. And those criticisms don't come only from, hardcore conservatives. They also come from liberals. I would name a person, Robert Asselin, who used to be the advisor of Finance Minister Bill Morneau. He's now with le Conseil canadien des affaires, yes, in English. And he is one of the more critical persons that I've seen slamming the government for spending too much, and now putting out policies that will stimulate growth. And so I listened a lot to what he said, because he used to be inside the government and he's not outside the government, and has a very interesting criticism to explore.
Traditionally, though, they've broken their promise on, let's say, years and years ago, modest budgets measured, and they haven't suffered for it among the electorate necessarily as of yet. Sure, there's a lot of different reasons that they've seen reduced results in the successive elections, but it doesn't seem on that note alone they've suffered. Do you think that changes going forward ever?
It does if interest rates stay high, if inflation stays high. That's really what makes this all different. This isn't just about, people wanting balanced budgets. This is about ensuring that the government isn't contributing to inflation, isn't forcing the Bank of Canada to keep interest rates high for longer. And so I think things change a lot once we start seeing rate cuts, and it'll be a different conversation in terms of the challenges the government faces.
Whenever that is.
I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Madrid Amalise and JD Beckall.
Hello there, everybody. I just want to take a moment to tell you about something that's become a key part of my daily wellness routine, and that is AG1. Making your AG1 couldn't be simpler. One scoop from the bag into 10 ounces of cold water. You shake it up, and you're good to go. Now, I know you're thinking, how does it taste? It looks very green. Honestly,
spent her birthday, and that birthday, at least 50 days before that, held hostage by Hamas. Today, she's free, and Joel and I, together with so many Americans, are praying for the fact that she is going to be all right. You know, she's free and she's in Israel now. And so those who are now wrapping Abigail in love and care, the supportive services she needs, she's been through a terrible trauma. Abigail was among 13 hostages released today from Gaza under the brokered and sustained though intensive U.S. diplomacy. She's now safely in Israel, and we continue to press and expect for additional Americans will be released as well. We will not stop working until every hostage is returned to their loved ones. As I said when I spoke about this deal on Friday, this has been the product of a lot of hard work and weeks of personal engagement for me and my team. We've been in close contact with the leaders of Egypt and Israel, speaking with each one of them repeatedly over the past few weeks to help secure this deal. We spoke again yesterday with the Emir of Qatar now, and we will continue to remain personally engaged to see that this deal is fully implemented and work to extend the deal as well. For weeks, I've been advocating the pause in the fighting for two purposes: to increase the assistance getting into the Gaza civilians who need help, and to facilitate release of hostages. We know that innocent children in Gaza are suffering greatly as well, because this war that Hamas has unleashed has such consequences. Thousands have been killed, and from the earliest days of this crisis, I worked closely with President Sisi of Egypt, the Israeli government, King Abdullah of Jordan, and leaders throughout the region to expand the delivery of critical humanitarian assistance to help innocent Palestinians in need. We're not part of Hamas. Under this deal, fighting in Gaza has now been paused for 3 days. Over that time, 58 hostages have been released, including the Thai, Filipino, and Russian nationals. Dozens of families have been reunited. And we worked urgently to take advantage of the pause to surge aid into Gaza. We've moved approximately 200 aid trucks into Gaza each day, loaded with food, water, medicine, fuel, and cooking gas. More is needed, but this deal is delivering life-saving results. Critically needed aid is going in, and the hostages are coming out. This deal is structured so that it can be extended, to keep building on these results. That's my goal, that's our goal, to keep this pause going beyond tomorrow, so that
Bless.
more hostages come out and surge more humanitarian relief into those in need in Gaza. We've seen this is the day-by-day approach, hour-by-hour process. Nothing is guaranteed, and nothing is being taken for granted. But the proof that this is working and worth pursuing further is in every smile and every grateful tear we see on the faces of those families who are finally getting back together again. The proof is little Abigail. More than 20 other children, 18 years and younger, have been released. They've been released through this deal as well. They've endured a terrible ordeal and can now begin a long journey toward healing. I'm going to continue working with the Emir of Qatar, President Sisi of Egypt, and Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, to do everything possible to see the hostages are free, all the hostages. I'm grateful for the personal partnership as we review this deal from each of those men I just mentioned. And as we've worked together to see all this implemented, and now to try to extend it further. I'll continue working with all our partners to take the hard but necessary steps to build an integrated, more prosperous, and more peaceful future in the region. A two-state solution is the only way to guarantee the long-term security of both Israelis and Palestinian people. To make sure Israel and Palestinians alike live in equal measure of freedom and dignity. We'll not give up on working toward that goal. So thank you very much. Thank God she's home. I just can't imagine the enjoyment. I wish I were there to hold it.
Mr. President, do you have an update on the other Americans who are being held and any sense as to when they would be released?
We are hopeful, but I don't have anything firmly to tell you at this moment.
Sir, do you expect that if Bahrain will use this momentum to extend the pause, have you extracted any guarantees about proof that will
longer you can push this off? Well, look, you know the deal calls for every 10 hostages released to extend another day. So I'm hopeful this is not the end. It's going to continue, but we don't know. And but I get a sense that all the players in the region, even the neighbors who have been directly involved now, are looking for a way to end this so the hostages are all released and Hamas is completely, how can I say, no longer in control of any portion of Gaza.
All of the hostages, or there's still other militant groups that you have to deal with?
We think there are probably other militant groups, but we're not certain.
Mr. President, how is Abigail doing? What's her physical condition? Do you have any information?
I haven't gotten that information. I just wanted to let you know immediately. They were going across into Egypt, if you recall. That was the route. But an older, non-American elderly woman is very sick and was in need of immediate medical help. So they arranged to cross directly into Israel so they will take her to a hospital. All I know is that she's been held. I don't know, I haven't seen a photograph. I'm just in communication with my team. But she is safely ensconced in Israel. But there's a lot more work to be done. I would like to see us move to a point where we were able to, well, let me put it this way. I'd like to see the pause go on as long as prisoners kept coming out.
The issue of anti-Semitism here in Australia, which we know is on the rise. A few days ago, we saw the PM speaking at the opening of a Holocaust museum in Melbourne, where he vowed that anti-Semitism had no place in Australia. Let's take a listen to some of what he said.
As the conflict continues, anti-Semitism is on the rise, but we will not let it find as much as a foothold here. Australia will always denounce it and reject it utterly, just as we do all forms of racism and
lot of eloquent words to describe great design. But they are just unnecessary, aren't they? The Kia EV9, here to reshape the way we move. Kia, movement that inspires.
I've spent centuries evolving with the world. That's the nature of being the economy, observing investors choose assets to balance risk and reward, with one element securing portfolios time after time: gold. Agile and liquid, a proven protector. An ever-evolving enabler of bold decisions. An asset more relevant than ever before. Gold, your strategic advantage.
The issue of anti-Semitism here in Australia, which we know is on the rise. A few days ago, we saw the PM speaking at the opening of a Holocaust museum in Melbourne, where he vowed that anti-Semitism had no place in Australia. Let's take a listen to some of what he said.
As the conflict continues, anti-Semitism is on the rise, but we will not let it find as much as a foothold here. Australia will always denounce it and reject it utterly, just as we do all forms of racism and prejudice.
But as Paul Kelly pointed out quite rightly, I think, in his column in the Oz this weekend, it's too late. The foothold is already established. We've already seen anti-Jewish rhetoric in the media and on the streets. I mean, October the 8th, people yelling, "Gas the Jews" on the steps of the Sydney Opera House. School kids skipping class this week to attend pro-Palestinian rallies. I mean, Caroline, I don't think the Prime Minister can sit there with a straight face and say, well, we're going to stop it in its tracks. Mate, the tracks are already 100 miles up the road.
It doesn't have a foothold. It's already at the top of the ladder. It's way too late. And part of the problem has been how the government has tried to talk out of both sides of its mouth on this issue.
Well,
Albanese has to take some responsibility. Well, exactly. Their own cabinet is divided when you have ministers like Ed Husick saying that Israel is engaging in collective punishment of Palestinians.
Which is a war crime.
Exactly. And there is no basis for that kind of statement. It belongs firmly with completely ignorant protesters who are professional protesters on the street and other people who have irrational biases against the Jewish people and the Jewish state. But he doesn't help, because when he speaks about this issue, he invariably has to mention Islamophobia at the same time, when that is not the issue we're talking about here. Of course, people are against all kinds of racism, but the problem at the moment is anti-Semitism, and the government itself, and the Prime Minister especially, does not have moral clarity on that issue.
Look at the way the US responded, Shari, where shortly after October 7, they started up the first ever, fight against Islamophobia, an official thing out of the White House. Like, could you read the room?
I know, it's exactly the same thing. And I think to some people, they think, oh, well, and probably the Prime Minister himself doesn't understand what he's done wrong, because he technically hasn't said anything wrong. But his handling of this, his management, couldn't have been worse, and it is so deeply offensive and distressing. We have an unprecedented anti-Semitism crisis. This is, the antithesis of what Australia stands for, of what our values are, and our political leadership has allowed it to fester and explode on our very street. And Caroline is right. Albanese has allowed this because he continues to lecture Israel. Penny Wong continues to lecture Israel about its military tactics. They're allowing the incorrect perception out there that Israel has committed war crimes. It hasn't. Israel has gone above and beyond what any other country engaging in war does, staying on the phone to people until they evacuate their apartments, sending 6 million text messages to people begging them to leave, delaying a ground incursion because people weren't leaving northern Gaza. Israel is doing everything it can to protect civilian lives, and yet our media keep reporting these figures from Hamas. Well, I'm sorry, but they're wrong. We already know with that bombing at the hospital that wasn't Israel in the end, but after 5 minutes, the figures came out claiming, 500 people were killed.
In the end, it was 50. In the end, Israel hadn't bombed the hospital. The bombing was in the car park, not in the hospital. But why that's important is because it shows you a very clear example of how quickly they come up with a death toll. And besides, not only are these figures from Hamas, but they do not distinguish between the loss of life between civilians and terrorists.
And the loss of life that Hamas itself causes.
Exactly.
But I just want to, before I let someone else have a go, because there's enough criticism of Jews taking over the media without completely dominating this episode. I just want to say, I think you're being too generous to Albanese here. I think he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows what he's doing. He's appealing to his base in Western Sydney, the seats that Liber have there. A lot of Muslim people who sympathise, obviously, with the pro-Palestinian cause. There's a lot of people in his own seat in the inner west who would sympathise with the Greens and the far-left protesters. And he's thinking about those seats. It's a political decision.
I think that is a bit rough. I don't think that is. I think Albanese comes from a background of the left. I don't think he's been particularly, I don't think he's given a huge amount of thought to this issue, quite frankly.
He's spent so many years railing against
over the course of but what he is being criticised from his own size. All those people you mentioned, they have criticised him for being too pro-Israel. They do not think he is towing their
Prime Minister of Australia. This crisis is happening on his watch.
I know. Absolutely. That's right. And I
stand up, and he has never done a press conference in the blue room and stood there and said, "This has to stop. Stop protesting because it's anti-Semitic. You're calling for the destruction of the Jewish homeland. It's unacceptable."
And that goes back to the point you made before about the way the propaganda from Hamas was allowed to proliferate through the media after that strike near a hospital which came out of Palestine itself. In that regard, Hamas has been able to win the information war because it doesn't care. It can make anything it wants up and it publishes it immediately.
Because it's got useful idiots like Greta Thunberg and Gigi Haddad and Bella Haddad, spreading lies.
And the effect of that, and the effect of all these protests we keep seeing, because they continue unabated, is that even though the people who rock up to those protests, Paul, may, in the grand scheme of things of the total Australian population, be a minority, they rock up in great number and they rock up in force. And so it gives the impression that they stand with the majority. And that's why the information war, the showing, matters so much.
All right, let's all play a game together. Now, I was thinking about how to frame this, and there's no right way to frame this. I'm going to get into trouble whatever I say here, so let's all enjoy my final appearance on TV. If you had taken, what would Australia's response be to, let's even say, 50 protesters who walked up the main drag of any place in the country, and pick any race you want, and they held up signs saying, "Kill the," or "the place would be better off without the," or "get rid of the." Our response as a society would be utter revulsion. The response of the political class would be to immediately seek sanction. If any of them had jobs, the people would be cancelled. If the kids were prefects at school, they'd be suspended. If there's any further insight about the, not nudge, wink, wink, encouragement, but the lack of response, is replace the word Jew with anything else. Of course. And what would the response, and that's where I've said before.
I don't know why you would have thought that was a controversial point to make.
Because, of course, but my point is that I was going to start offering examples, and then I realised that might be my final appearance on TV. I'll do that final appearance. But you get my point, and this is where I've been railing against Claire O'Neill's Home Affairs Minister, right? She's the boss of the ministerial responsibility of the AFP, ASIO, and Border Force, right? She should have come out the day after those hate preachers first started to appear, saying, "Sorry, not on. I've called a meeting of all the people. How are these people being policed?" Instead, it's not happening. Instead, change the subject over here, change the subject over there. So I think we can all see what the intensity of the government is, and the intensity of the government is to try to ride this out. And when you're talking about people on the streets of Australia saying that certain populations should die, You're not going to be able to ride that out.
I can tell you exactly what the problem is. The problem is there has been such a long-standing anti-Israel position from the hard left and also from the left of the Labour Party, and I'm certainly not denying that. If you look at, for example, the response from even Albo, who I think has been not as bad as a lot of people are saying, but Chris Minns, who has been really, really strong, the dyed-in-the-wool Labour right Premier of New South Wales. It's been a real study in contrast. And again, I say this as someone who thinks that Albo thinks that he is saying the right thing, that he thinks that he is saying the right thing. The problem is, and it's almost more insidious than I suppose all of us are sort of thumping the desk and talking about it, is that for so long there's been a fig leaf of anti-Zionism, if you like, that has covered the anti-Semitism that is ultimately, whether they know it or not, at the very heart of the left's position. But again, they couldn't possibly allow themselves to think these things about any other ethnicity, any other race. And if you want to have the most perfect example of all, let's just think about that Jewish school that tried to book a jumping castle and got told, no, go and get F, you Zionist murderers or whatever. Just imagine if an Islamic school had tried to book a jumping castle and the business had said, no way am I giving that to you, you bunch of terrorists. And those are two exactly analogous things. And so the people say that, you know, oh no, it's not Jews we have a problem with, it's Israel or it's Zionists, as if anyone who's Jewish is going to be opposed to Jerusalem or Israel. So there are a few self-hating, but that's semantics as it stands. But again, just imagine though if the same argument applied. Oh no, we're not anti-Muslim, we're just anti-terrorist, but we also think that all Muslims are terrorists.
And a lot of what allows this study to move as it does is, of course, the media coverage, as Sherry mentioned before, and the conflict has, you know, been dominating the media for more than a month now.
Black Friday is here at Hudson's Bay. Shop the deals and door crashers now.
The Palestinian-Israel conflict has nothing to do with land. It's an existential battle. The Palestinians are always the noble victims of the anti-Semitism on campus. That's the anti-Semitism that simply comes from faulty education. The anti-Semitism that comes from the Middle East is inherent to the doctrines of that faith. The Jew is tolerated in Islamic lands as long as he has the status of a dhimmi. Don't you dare ever criticize Islam. That's Islamophobic. Any land that has ever been occupied by Islam can never revert to anybody else.
Anti-Israel protests have broken out across the world since Israel began pounding Gaza after Hamas's deadly attack on October 7th. Aggressive protests have taken place on campuses in the US and Canada, and at times they have become anti-Semitic. We spoke to Professor Gad Saad, who teaches in Canada's Concordia University on the protests and the Israel-Hamas war. He is the author of two bestsellers, The Parasitic Mind and The Sad Truth About Happiness.
Why is there this deep-seated anti-Israel and anti-Semitic sentiments in academia and on campuses?
So it's a complex question. So it depends who is the source of the Jew hatred. There could be Islamic-based Jew hatred, which is one topic. There could be far-right Jew hatred, which is another group. There could be progressive leftist Jew hatred, that's a third group. So they may be coming at their Jew hatred from different positions, but at least they're all united in their common hatred of the Jew. And so it really depends. Now, in the context of university campuses, look, many of these disciplines that I discuss in the parasitic mind, you know, ethnic studies and peace studies and postmodernism and women's studies and intersectional feminism and all the rest of that stuff, they view the world through the eyes of a binary world of oppressed and oppressor. And therefore, and it's very not unlike how in Marxism you have the bourgeoisie and you have the proletariat, right? So the world is binary. There is the group on the right that's nice and the group on the left that's mean. And they have decided that the right message to send is that the Palestinians are always the noble victims, and the Zionist Nazi regime is always the oppressor, and therefore everything that is taught on university campuses in what's called Near East Studies programs or Middle Eastern programs is always viewed through the lens of, until 1948, the Jews and Muslims lived in perpetual loving peace in that area. And then these really nasty guys from Europe that have absolutely no link to that land called Israel, absolutely none, came along, and then they took over that land, stole it, and since they've been engaging in a 75-year genocide. Now, not a single syllable of that is true, but yet that is the message that is promulgated on every campus. So it wouldn't be surprising then that if I am a product of those universities, if I'm a student that's come out of those universities, and if that's the only message that I hear from my esteemed professors, then that's what I'm going to believe. So that would be one reason why you see the anti-Semitism on campus. That's the anti-Semitism that simply comes from faulty education. Okay. Now, the anti-Semitism that comes from the Middle East, that is inherent to the doctrines of that faith. In other words, people of that faith define their identity in part as a function of their existential hatred of the Jew. So if you have diabetes, it's the Jew who caused it. If your wife cheated on you, it's the Jew who put those thoughts in her head. If it's raining outside, it's the Jews that manipulate the weather. If your business has failed, it's probably some Jew that's in the background that has caused it to fail. Now, that's a very alluring psychological mechanism, because we know that in psychology, when people are attributing successes and failure, this is called the fundamental attribution error. People tend to attribute successes internally. I did well on the exam because I'm smart and I studied hard. And they attribute failures externally. I did poorly on the exam because Professor Saad is a mean guy and he's unfair. Okay? Now, what a beautiful thing it is that I can attribute all of the failures, whether it be at the individual level or at the society level, to one key culprit. It's the diabolical, scheming Jew. Now, you don't have to believe me. You can just
Are you ready, kids? Aye, aye, Captain. The Paramount Plus is the streaming home of all things football.
The Hamas militant group has handed over another batch of hostages. The 13 Israelis and 4 Thai nationals are now safe in Israel after the Red Cross escorted them from Gaza. The release was delayed after Hamas accused Israel of preventing aid trucks from reaching northern Gaza. Afterwards, Israel released another group of 39 Palestinians who had been held in Israeli prisons. They are seen here in a Red Cross bus arriving to a welcoming crowd in the West Bank town of Baitunia. This was the second group of Palestinian prisoners to be freed as part of the 4-day truce between Israel and Hamas. Hamas has only agreed to release 50 of about 240 hostages they are believed to be holding. Family members described an agonizing wait for the second release late Saturday night as negotiations dragged on for hours, the deal almost collapsing before the captives were released. DW's Ben Fajulian spoke to some of them gathered in central Tel Aviv who say they won't rest until all the hostages are freed.
They're here to give the hostages left behind a voice. The demonstrators want the Israeli government to do more. It's been 50 days. That's why rally organizers called up a 50,000-strong crowd. They say 100,000 came to what's now known as Hostage Square, including family and friends of Gadi Trachansky. Hamas terrorists took her captive on October 7, later killing her brother.
This 13-year-old girl who doesn't know that her brother was killed. Her parents didn't even do a funeral yet because they're waiting for the girl. So we're really worried and we want them home.
She's one of so many still in captivity, with the clock ticking and a ceasefire that could break any time. That's not stopping a nation from uniting.
People who have family members who were murdered are here to support the people whose families are being hostage, and I think that means everything. The Israeli society must rise from this moment, and I think this evening here shows that.
Even relatives of those already released are here tonight. This symbolic banquet table finally beginning to fill with its guests, the freed hostages like Adina Moshe.
We are all excited, so excited. The joy of everybody in the family was amazing. Yesterday we had shouted of joy and cheerful once we heard that we saw her picture through the Egyptian TV in the vehicle of the Hamas going to be released. And you know, we prepared this type of shirts, which we are not going to use anymore. But today we come here to stand by with the whole families of hostages, because we are one big family. And though they released Adina Moshe, there are still over 200 hostages still in Gaza Strip. And my family, we came more than 30 people to support, and we continue to come. We know the whole families will stay together until everybody is going to be released.
And your aunt is quite defiant, I believe.
My aunt is amazing. She's a powerful lady. Even though she's 72 years old, when she go out of the Hamas vehicle, she slapped the terrorist on his hand, which became viral everywhere. So maybe she's weak in body, but they never managed to break a spirit. She's a powerful one.
Something to celebrate tonight. Because who knows what tomorrow will bring. The roller coaster of emotions continues, and this is far from over.
It's a difficult situation. Everyone knows people down here are told they're leaving it up to the government to do their job. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu repeated again today, it is one of their priorities, releasing these hostages. Of course, he also wants to defeat Hamas, but releasing the hostages is not the #1 priority, and that's what families down here have a problem with.
DW's Tanya Kramer is standing by in Jerusalem. Hello, Tanya. A huge turnout for that rally at Hostage Square in Tel Aviv. Is the public pressure on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu increasing or easing due to the hostage releases by Hamas?
The vote hovers around 1,000 votes, and they all use it.
think it is both, and we heard it in this report. I think right now the focus is on really getting those 50 hostages that were agreed upon in this agreement out from Gaza. Today is the third day that we're expecting again more hostages to be released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. But of course the pressure on the government will not subside, and the huge turnout on Saturday night in Tel Aviv shows that, because what people are really concerned about is that for now it's, you know, those 50 hostages. There's still also, it's very clear, it is a very fragile process. We saw it on Saturday when, you know, the hostage, the freeing of the hostage was was delayed, and there will be afterwards still almost 200 hostages that will be still being held in Gaza. So families there are very concerned about it. But we've also seen a bit of a smaller demonstration in Jerusalem in front of the Prime Minister's residence on Saturday night with people calling for his resignation. And I think at the moment the focus is, of course, that the nation comes together to free those hostages. But the questions how the government handled it and what has been done, these will not subside, and they might grow stronger once, you know, the hostages are brought back home.
As you said, it's a very fragile process. There was a lot more tension on Saturday with the release process. What went wrong?
Well, the delay came after Hamas accused Israel of violating the agreement. We know publicly Hamas said that Israel was, on the one hand, interfering in this selection process, how the Palestinian prisoners that are slated to be released, that is also every day, were selected, and they also said that no aid was arriving actually in the north of Gaza. Israel had denied that, and Egyptian and Qatari mediators interfered. They were mediating, and they said they finally solved the issue, and the hostages were released, and very late on Saturday night they were handed over to the International Red Cross. Then were brought on the Israeli side to the hospitals, and they were overnight then reunited with their families.
So, at one point, the Israeli defense minister said if Hamas would not release hostages as planned yesterday, negotiations would continue, quote, under fire. Was the Israeli military ready to restart hostilities, you think?
Well, I think this threat is always there, because Israel has made it very clear that, you know, even once the 4 days that have been agreed upon, although there are talks now that they might be extended, that maybe more hostages might be released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, but that the war will resume one way or another. And this has been talked about here. They have been very open about it, because their goal is to eliminate Hamas and to dismantle their infrastructure. So this threat is very much always there.
Before you go, Tanya, can we expect another exchange today? That seems to be the plan, right?
That is the plan. We understand that the Prime Minister's office has released a statement that they have again received a list of names of the hostages that are expected to be released today. We're expecting it maybe in the same time frame, again in the afternoon. We're not yet having all this information about it. Of course, this is good news, because it means the process is ongoing, but it's also very necessary, because humanitarian aid organizations are saying they need also this time to get the aid that is also part of this agreement into Gaza, and they're hoping, of course, that the time will be extended for that.
Okay, DW's Tanya Kramer. Thank you.
Let's start in lefty heartland California, where another retail store, this time a Nordstrom, was
Black Friday with unbeatable deals. Get up to 20% off MSRP on Sniper EFI, Holly EFI, Diablo Sport, Flowmaster, Race Quip, and our stylish apparel. Your dream upgrades and gear are just a click away. It's all happening at Holly.com.
I'm not Superwoman. I'm not any different than anybody else.
I was an assistant service manager for a Chrysler dealership.
In February of 2021, I was promoted to principal of an elementary school, and then as soon as I kind of made...
This is a really precarious moment in Israel's history right now, as I'm sure you and I agree. Israel's been at war now for more than 50 days against Hamas, given what happened back on October 7th. 3 days into this temporary truce right now, how meaningful is it, Mr. President, right now, for Israelis to see at least some good news, some of the hostages being reunited with their families?
It is extremely important because we see human beings who are in the abyss without knowing their whereabouts and their fate, as well as the fact that they themselves are totally secluded and disconnected from the rest of the world. The fact that you see young girls, a young boy, or grandmothers walking through and going to Israeli hospitals and coming back and meeting their families is a huge emotional storm and something that gives us happiness, but of course happiness with a lot of sorrow in it, because there are at least 200 hostages still held out there in Hamas, under Hamas duress, somewhere in bunkers somewhere, without knowing how they live and what their whereabouts. Some family torn apart. Most of the hostages that were released have still family members left behind, meaning tearing the families apart. And as you can see, throughout the last few days, Hamas is treading on our psychology with a kind of a passive-aggressive approach, which wants to drive us as a nation crazy because of the emotions filled and because of the extreme pain and worry of so many relatives to their friends and family who are out there in Gaza.
As you know, Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, said yesterday, and I'm quoting him now, any further negotiations will be held under fire, end quote. Is he effectively closing the door to extending the truce?
So we have to first remember that there are a few more days of release of the hostages, whilst Israel is releasing terrorists who are charged and imprisoned for terror activities, including taking lives of people or threatening to take lives of people. And this is a very gruesome process. So I don't want to speak about the next step, but it is clear to us that if we want to prevent further terror against Israel from Gaza and change the future of the Middle East and the way the Palestinians have some hope, the only way to do it in a human way, in order to protect the human values in the region, is by uprooting Hamas, and that will lead to the fact that we have to take further action and undermine Hamas's military capabilities.
I'm anxious to get your thought. If Hamas agrees to another day, another few days of this truce in order to release more Israeli hostages, should Israel accept that?
So that is already being negotiated. First of all, it was agreed in the original agreement, which has been violated constantly by Hamas, but still implemented piecemeal, that if they bring another 10 prisoners or so, or the exact number, of course, is in the agreement itself, there will be an extension of another day of humanitarian pause. So that is already agreed. They can definitely bring many more hostages and release them. They kind of said that they don't know where their whereabouts are. That looks to us totally false, because they've been controlling Gaza to the last iota for the last 20 odd years in a very cruel regime that didn't let anybody move without their permission. So that is why I fully hope that in this instance they will release more and more, and they will get more and more humanitarian pauses. As to what happens afterwards, it is clear that we intend to complete the task, meaning undermine the military capabilities of Hamas as an entity and enable a different future for those who live near the border, for Israelis and Palestinians, for the ability to undermine this empire of evil which operates from Tehran and of course impacts the entire region.
So I just want to be precise, Mr. President. In order to get more Israeli hostages released, do you think Israel should agree to extend the truce?
So Israel depends. So far, the agreement speaks about.
The agreement was for 4 days.
No,
right?
but it says specifically that any additional 10 or so hostages released, there will be another day of humanitarian pause, and that is what is being implemented. As to what happens next, there is a Qatari delegation in Israel today, and I think they're talking to the relevant authorities in the Israeli government as to the next phase.
So you are open to extending the truce?
So again, the way you interpret the word truce is complicated. We've already agreed, we made it public, that if above the initial 4 days, there's a release of further prisoners, 10 per day or something, 10, 11, I don't have the exact numbers, we will extend the humanitarian pause, meaning the truce. That's the way
you call it a pause.
Yes.
Yeah.
But our clear intention is to go in and complete the job, because we must not enable this base of terror, this platform of terror, which was taken over by cruel coup d'etat in 2007 by Hamas, to continue. And how would you expect anybody who went through these horrific torments and horrific scene and this barbaric attack on October 7th with rape and torture and beheading and chopping and mutilating bodies and abducting hostages? How do you expect anybody to go back there if there's no complete end to this threat?
So let's talk a little bit about looking down the road. After this war with Hamas, you have said Israel, and I'm quoting you now, can't leave a vacuum in Gaza. So will Gaza be governed by a revitalized Palestinian Authority as President Biden has proposed?
So here, this is something really important to go into and discuss, because people have to be serious. If we want to prevent the recurrence of further terror, if we want to go into a stable horizon in the region, we have to be lucid about it. Is there any force in the world, in the region, which is willing to take over and run the place in terms of the security and preventing further horrors, sadistic and barbaric jihadist activity? Somebody has to say who it's going to be. When there are nations who say we won't have boots on the ground, when there are nations who say, of course not, we leave the dirty job to you guys. So when Israel says, right now, the security and well-being of this place in terms of the security element, meaning fighting terror, enforcing law and order, adjudicating and so forth, will stay in Israeli hands until there is an agreement. One has to build the alternative. The alternative needs to be discussed in various key places and see what's next. In the interim, there has to be a major humanitarian aid and a major humanitarian effort. In this respect, for example, I commend the hospital which is being built now in Rafah by the United Arab Emirates. There are other countries who are making similar efforts, and we commend them as well. But the most advanced project so far, for example, for another new hospital in the Gaza Strip, is done by United Arab Emirates, and yesterday trucks came in order to build this hospital in Rafah. So there should be an overall effort to make something that makes sense for the future and well-being of Israelis and Palestinians.
So what should the governing authority of Gaza be after this Israel-Hamas war, if it's not the Palestinian Authority?
So I've been saying many times, and I'll say it again, this is not only a war between Israel and Hamas. This is actually a war that defends the real values of liberal and democratic countries, or countries who believe in the rules of the family of nations, as opposed to an empire of evil, which is an empire of jihadists which believe only in eradicating all of us out of here, not only Jews, but also Christians, and the next would be Europe and the United States. So that is what the war is all about, and therefore, how you come out of the war, meaning how do you make sure that what will come out of the war will promise regional security and stability, will promise peace, or let's say ceasing of fire and terror. This is the key. This has to be analyzed clearly and in a very punctual way, not slogans. I heard President Biden's speech on Friday from his vacation, and I truly welcome these words. I mean, these were important words as he spoke about the fact that there is an empire of evil which wants to undermine all the peace processes in the region. It is clear that what Hamas did under the instructions of Iran is to undermine the ability of further peace agreements following the Abraham Accords, also peace agreement with Saudi Arabia, and offering a huge connection between Europe all the way down to Australia.
Stroud throwing on first down, steps up in the pocket and completes it to Tank Dell. Up to the 40-yard line, a gain of 15. Third down and 9.
The Irish rising. The
Yes, Lord. How deep we going? Let's see. Stay low. I feel.
The highly anticipated truce between Israel and Hamas is now underway. This is the scene live looking over Gaza from Israel. A 4-day temporary ceasefire appears to be holding ahead of an anticipated hostage prisoner swap later today. It follows weeks of the most intense fighting in the Israeli-Hamas conflict. Let's cross over now to our special correspondent, Aya Ibrahim, who's following the story for us in Jerusalem. Aya, great to see you again. So the temporary ceasefire came into effect several hours ago. Are the two sides adhering to it?
We are in the very early hours of what is a very delicate temporary ceasefire, and while there have not been any major bombings, rocket fire, or artillery strikes, both sides accuse each other of minor sporadic violations, but so far the ceasefire, the temporary ceasefire, seems to be holding, but the situation is very volatile. It's unclear if Hamas has control over all of its fighters in the Gaza Strip, and they're of course not the only armed militant group in the Strip, and so 4 days of a temporary ceasefire, a lot could go wrong and a lot could happen. There's also the question of what if the Israeli military within these 4 days identifies a high-value target. It will then be confronted with the difficult choice of going after that target or continuing with the ceasefire. The situation on the ground for civilians also very volatile. Fears from the Israeli side that civilians in the south will want to start heading to the north, as we touched on in that report, and they are warning them with leaflets not to do that, not to go back to the north, as the Israeli army says that is still a very dangerous part of the Gaza Strip for civilians.
Aya, how are people in Israel feeling now that the pause in fighting is underway?
It's a mixed feeling. There's of course a lot of relief and joy at the hostages that will hopefully be released starting today. It's an emotional roller coaster, especially for the hostage families who are, as we speak, getting phone calls, waiting for phone calls that could be the ones that tell them that their loved ones are on their way. There's also a sense of dread that even with this deal, we're only talking about 50 women and children out of more than 200 hostages believed to be held by Hamas, and not everyone will be coming back under the terms of the deal as it stands at the moment. There's also criticism for that deal coming from a minority in Israeli politics, the right wing, a minority but a very vocal one that has been from the beginning staunchly opposed to this deal, claiming that it plays into Hamas's advantage and that the militant group will be using this time to recalibrate, regroup, and that this ceasefire puts it in a better position to attack Israel and to delay Israel's timeline to reach its goals, which is ultimately eradicating Hamas completely from the Gaza Strip.
This is planned for 4 days, but Israel's military says it's already preparing for what it says are the next stages of this war. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, we have a very clear message from the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that the war is not over and that the fighting is expected to continue once the ceasefire, the temporary ceasefire, has expired, and that's because, according to Israeli officials, the goal to eradicate Hamas completely is yet to be achieved. Up until the very beginning of the ceasefire, we saw intense fighting and bombardment of the Strip, and according to the IDF, until the very last minute, they say they were still in the process of destroying Hamas's tunnel network. So as far as the Israeli side is concerned, this war will continue after the temporary ceasefire, although they have also signaled that they are willing to extend the temporary ceasefire by 1 day for 10 hostages. So it's unclear what exactly will happen, but as far as the
Here with me now is White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Javier.
Here, Debbie digs through user content to share on her website. In a glorious display, she customizes her ad-free player.
Javier Milei is a frank-talking maverick.
¡Zurdos, hijos de puta, tiemblen! ¡La libertad avanza! ¡Viva la libertad, carajo!
Who isn't afraid to say what he's really thinking.
decir, o sea, vos no podés negociar con el zurdo. No se negocia. No se negocia con esa mierda, no se negocia porque te van a llevar puesto.
He surged in popularity with his anti-socialism rhetoric during a time of upheaval in Argentina.
El socialismo es siempre y en todo lugar un fenómeno violento, asesino y empobrecedor. Esa es la característica del socialismo.
And campaigned on a promise to shake things up.
Adoctrinamiento, afuera. Ministerio de Transporte, afuera. Ministerio de Salud, afuera. Ministerio de Desarrollo Social, afuera. Se acabó el curro de la política. ¡Viva la libertad, carajo!
Javier Milei will now become Argentina's next president after claiming victory in the contentious election. But who exactly is the man being described as the Donald Trump of Argentina? And how will he go entering the political fray? Sky News Digital Originals presents Who is Javier Milei? Argentina is facing a myriad of issues. In the throes of recession, it battles an eye-watering inflation rate of 142.7%, a stark contrast to the US at 3.24% and Australia at 5.4%. This isn't the first time Argentina has danced with economic disaster. 3 sovereign debt defaults since 2000 bear witness to a troubled financial history. Fast forward to today, and the country finds itself in the clutches of one of the most severe economic crises in 2 decades. The economic crisis is hitting the population hard, with 1 in 10 Argentinians now living in poverty. The Argentine peso is taking a nosedive, plummeting more than 90% against the almighty US dollar. Desperate times call for drastic measures. Cue Javier Milei, the unyielding libertarian, storming onto the scene, elected president on a radical mandate for change.
He is an outsider. I mean, 3 years ago, nobody in Argentina has heard of him. He has won the presidency with that campaign, some of which he showed, of being a channel for the immense anger and frustration that Argentines feel because for the last 10 years there's been no economic growth. Inflation, as you mentioned, is heading for 200% this year. The central bank has no reserves. The government deficit is very large. It's financed by just printing pesos, and thus the value of the peso goes down. Many people were very fed up with the ruling terrorists who have been there for most of the past 20 years and have a powerful machine, but they really have no policies to get the country going again. Now, the big question is, can Milei actually deliver serious economic reform? He got a very large popular mandate in the vote, but his party is very small. He doesn't have a majority in the Congress, and you showed that there are questions about how stable a personality he has and how effective he will be at doing the negotiations he will have to do if he's to govern.
He has won decisively, sending shockwaves around the world, 55 to 44. That's a decisive victory. He won his primary a couple months ago with similar margins. He's a political outsider, 54 years old, was a musician, a soccer player, all sorts of things, a TV personality, and then a classical libertarian who kind of came out of nowhere and did this. And why is this capturing the world's attention? Because Argentina is a cautionary tale of a once prosperous society that can go down so quickly. Buenos Aires was one of the richest cities in the world less than a century ago. They infamously defaulted on their debt 20 years ago. They got hyperinflation, 140, 50%. We don't like it at 7% over here. Think about that. 40% of their population is below the poverty line. You put that together, and it's kind of like, what do you have to lose? And this outsider comes in like a wrecking ball, and it'll be very interesting to watch.
So Argentina is very different from most Western nations. You know, it's got 140% inflation and 40% of its population living in poverty. But I do think you can link it to trends in the West. What has happened here is the Argentine electorate has said that politics as usual is no good anymore. It's just not working. Centre-left and centre-right. And they've got the same problems as Western governments have, but they've got them in a much more advanced degree. Massive government deficit, inability to run coherent economic policy, tax policy out of control, people not paying their taxes and so on. And so electorates which are absolutely fed up with centre-right and centre-left look for alternatives on the far right or the far left. I wouldn't quite necessarily describe this guy as far right. He's not a kind of a Nazi or authoritarian or something. He's a new breed. He's a libertarian. So he wants radical economic change. He wants a big cut to the size of the Argentine state. He wants to abolish the local currency and dollarize the economy so that it has to live genuinely within its means. I mean, a dollarized economy, making the US dollar the official currency of Argentina, is very tough medicine for Argentina, but it does force you to live really within your means. So I think it's a fascinating development, and he's going to have a lot of trouble governing because he doesn't have parliamentary majority or anything like that. You might get a lot of conflict in Argentina, but the election of Trump, the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, the Brexit vote, these are all signs of electorates saying we're fed up with politics as usual, and the alternatives they choose can be quite radical.
The solutions put forward by Milei are quite radical, and he has compromised them between the first and second round, which is what enabled him to win, because it meant that the established opposition, the former president Mauricio Macri and Patricia Bullrich, that ran in the first round, put their support behind him, which is how he was able to have a victory. So he has compromised on some of those now infamous statements about, he's now fixing the central bank, not disbanding it and not getting rid of it. So we have seen some change in the tone, especially in his acceptance speech. But I think the main point to point out is this vote for an outsider, anti-establishment candidate in Argentina is not, Argentine voters didn't vote for his policies or for him. It's an anti-Peronist vote, and it's a anti-government protest vote. It doesn't necessarily mean that the people who voted for him endorse the policies that he's been spouting on during his campaign.
It means that more and more people are rallying around the outsiders, which Trump always was. I mean, when he became president, people didn't know all that much about him, except that he was a rich guy and...
Celebrity apprentice.
Exactly, you're fired. And that was about it, right? But it meant that the institution had failed to get their guy up. And that outsider achieved more during his term than any other president before him, as far as I'm concerned, especially in terms of foreign policy. And didn't the world go to hell once the Biden administration unpicked all of that? But I just love this because at his core, when you watch his clips, this is a man who loves his country. He loves his people, and he doesn't give a flying rip about the haters. That's how he reflects Trump, and whether people like it or lump it, the world needs these kinds of leaders right now, because we are up against a visceral socialist contingent that is trying to push its agenda throughout, particularly the Western world. And it's only leaders like this that the media flip out about as well, because they're like, we can't control him. He's out of control, and he does not care.
And you'd be mistaken to look at those clips of him behaving in a crazy fashion, which allows him to break through with a media that is completely against him. But you'd be mistaken to think that that's who he is when you listen to him speaking seriously. I mean, he says things that other Western leaders should be saying, but are too afraid to say. He says the government generally causes more problems than it solves. He says social justice relies on two things: the approval of theft and the approval of inequality before the law. He says that we're in the middle of a culture war, and he says socialists do not let up because they're leeches who want to get everything for free, therefore you've got to fight them every single day. And then faced with death threats and asked, is he worried about his own safety? I love what he said. He said, life without freedom is not worth living.
Quite right. And see, this is like the whole erratic thing, right? Part of what made Trump successful was that you didn't know what he was going to do. Like that the perceived erratic nature of Donald Trump meant people were scared of him. I mean, could you think of anyone else who could have got North Korea, for heaven's sake, to come and sit down, Kim Jong-un, to sit down for a meeting, because they were so scared that Trump might actually do something. And you see shades of that in this bloke. If only we could get rid of Albo the Trot, as our good friend Bronwyn Bishop calls him, and get him over here. And hopefully this is a sign of a wave to come across the world.
So this guy, Javier Milei, is fascinating. Just a quick Google search tells me that he openly says he loves tantric sex, that he is a big promoter of threesomes, that he thinks he can speak to his dead dog via telepathy and is not embarrassed to say it, that he had his dogs cloned, and they're running around, I guess, advising him in the forelife as well as the after. He wants to get rid of virtually all of Argentina's government, and the people support this because they have 110% inflation in Argentina. It's a hot mess down there, so they are ready for a revolution. And we've seen this in place after place, not only the United States with Trump, but the UK had its period with Brexit. They've sort of calmed down and gone more traditionalist as of late. Now Argentina. The people are rising up against these so-called elites. And the more in your face these candidates are, the more beloved they become with the base. This guy, I mean, I'm sure you've seen some of the clips, because he's out there saying, you can't give, quote, libtards even an inch, not an inch. The rhetoric is colorful. It's entertaining. I wouldn't say it's unifying. It's definitely very divisive. But, their country like ours, is kind of in a fighting mood, and not in the mood to be offended by this lowbrow mudslinging, rather in the mood to join in it. It feels cathartic, and it feels for many like it's about time. So I can't wait to see what he does. I am sure it's going to be very controversial, but, you know, as Trump once put it, hey, what do you have to lose?
They're embarking on a radical experiment. I don't think even people who voted for it really know what's going to happen in the next coming days. But the euphoria and excitement on the streets is Argentines are really resilient. They've been through crisis after crisis and military dictatorships. The Peronists have governed the last 28 or 40 years of democracy since they redemocratized. And things are just up and down. It's constant volatility. Argentina also has the youngest voting age, which is 16, and it's predominantly young voters who didn't live the dictatorship and don't have that memory that their grandparents and parents have that really want to change. And I think Argentines, it marks the end of Peronist populism. It doesn't mean that, you know, when we compare it to Trump and Bolsonaro, you know, people, it's as if this is the first time populism has happened in Argentina. Populism was created in Argentina, and that's where it originally came from in theory in the 1940s. So, but that populism has always been Peronism. It's a really large state. It's very bureaucratic. And there's high levels of corruption, and Argentines, the opposition failed to produce a candidate, the established opposition, and so we have a completely outsider, anti-establishment candidate, libertarian, who's talking about the 19th century and returning Argentina back to its former glory.
I think he's clearly a very effective communicator, and you know, communicators in this world today tend to do quite well. But you know, I would repeat, it's one thing to get to the presidency, another thing to govern quite a large country, right? A complicated country. And he's not stupid. I mean, he's an economist. He hasn't been a kind of particularly prominent economist. He worked in the private sector for quite a long time. What we don't know, and there are lots of things we don't know about it, we don't know how good he will be at building a team, at delegating, letting bright people get on with the job, you know?
The president-elect is wasting no time flexing his global influence. Malay is demanding the return of the Falkland Islands, but UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is firmly rejecting any talks on sovereignty.
Initially, there was the threat of, is this nutter going to try to go to war with us? And there is that polite reminder to this chap that, you know, we did send the Argentinians packing not so long ago at the cost of around 250 British service personnel and around 690, I think it was, Argentinians. He has said that he wants to try to reclaim it through diplomatic means. Well, the people of the Falkland Islands have spoken. In 2013, they had a referendum now, and a turnout of 92%, 99.8% voted to remain British. In fact, just 3 people decided that they wanted the Falklands to not remain British. So from a diplomatic perspective, that's where we are. Grant Shapps, our Defence Secretary, has seen fit to send a warship back to the Falklands, just in case. I do think that Javier Milei has got his hands tied, really, because you can't really say to the Argentinian people that you don't want them back. But look, I suppose the message from the Brits is back off their arse.
Javier Milei steps into Argentina's top role at a crucial juncture, facing unprecedented challenges. Is he ready for the daunting task ahead? Only time will tell.
I think there's no doubt that the Argentine state is too big and too inefficient, right? And that the private sector is weighed down with a lot of controls and regulations and so on, yeah? I mean, I think there's a...
In the days following the atrocities inflicted on Israel by Hamas, the progress... junk fees.
It's really...
Thousands of people gathered on Parliament. Thousands of people.
Cluster of new.
Now, as more hospitals.
Thousands of.
Ukraine's highly anticipated counteroffensive has so far failed to show significant victories, with dire consequences for its troops. A shortage of ammunition and less support from the West have brought the war against Russia to a standstill. Many Ukrainians are dreading the approaching winter because of renewed Russian attacks on critical infrastructure, and they're also worried about being abandoned by the West altogether. Will the winter bring a war of exhaustion that will further jeopardize Ukrainian integrity and independence? On to the point we ask, failing against Russia, can Ukraine survive the war? Welcome to this week's To The Point. I'm Javier Arias. It's good to have you with us, and I'm joined by today's guests. Gesine Dornblüt is a radio journalist and author and former correspondent for Germany's Deutschlandfunk in Russia. Roman Goncharenko is my DW colleague from Ukraine, currently working with DW's Russian service in Bonn. And Gustav Gressel is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations here in Berlin. To all of you, thank you for being with us today. Now, Gesine, I'd like to start with you. The situation in the Middle East has certainly drawn attention away from the war in Ukraine, but there also just haven't been major breakthroughs in the war in Ukraine for weeks or even months. How would you describe this moment in the Russia-Ukraine war?
I think it's a very, very critical moment because, as you said, the situation on the front is somehow stuck. Even you could say that Russia gains initiative again, especially in the east of Ukraine. At the same time, you have Vladimir Putin saying that only pretending to be ready to negotiate, but this is nothing but empty words. Indeed, he has the same goals for his war as he had earlier. He wants the whole Ukraine and more. And at the same time, you have the Ukrainian population. People are really afraid of the upcoming winter. And this psychological element is, I think, very, very worrisome and very important for the whole situation.
It's certainly hard to watch what's going on right now. Roman, Ukraine had promised a counteroffensive that would win back territory taken by Russia by the end of this fall here in Europe. It failed, according to Ukraine's own Valery Zaluzhny. What went wrong?
Well, Zaluzhny basically says that the reason for the situation we are in now, which is, some say it's a stalemate, some say we are close to it, but anyway, the situation is very dynamic, so I wouldn't call it a stalemate at this moment, because Russia is still trying to push. The main reason, according to the Ukrainian chief commander Valery Zaluzhny, you've been quoting, is that the level of technology, all those drones and surveillance equipment, they do not allow for either side to collect a lot of forces in one place. So to have enough power for a breakthrough. So Ukraine can do it, Russia can do it as well. But Russia has much more soldiers, much more heavy equipment, and Ukraine has to be very careful with the soldiers because it has much less resources than Russia, which is obvious. And this is one of the major reasons. So his message is we need to find a technological solution for this war to win, because we cannot expect anymore that more tanks or more military jets will help us to achieve a quick victory. So it will be a long war. And we need to be sure that the West continues to support us, but we also need to be looking for a technological solution. This is how he explains it.
He seems to be very realistic, also maybe not that optimistic. President Volodymyr Zelensky, Gustav, still appears to be very confident that Ukraine will win this war. Is he the only one?
Well, the problem is he has some reason to say that, because unlike in the West, where most people expect a stalemate to lead into a ceasefire, to lead into a frozen conflict, which is what the Chancellor or President Biden wants in the long run, he knows that there are basically two outcomes of this war. Russia wins or Ukraine wins. The Russian president is not playing for a stalemate.
Некоторые коллеги уже в своих выступлениях говорили о том, что их потрясает агрессия, продолжающаяся агрессия России на Украину. Да, конечно, военные действия – это всегда трагедия конкретных людей, конкретных семей, да и страны в целом. И, безусловно, мы должны думать о том, как прекратить эту трагедию. Кстати говоря, Россия никогда не отказывалась от мирных переговоров с Украиной. Это не Россия.
Dört günlük insani fasıla ilanı ve sınırlı sayıda olsa rehine ve tutukluların takası konusunda mutabakata varılması olumlu bir gelişmedir. Bu adımın önceliğimiz olan ve bir an evvel tesis edilmesini beklediğimiz kalıcı ateşkese ve barışa vesile olmasını temenni ediyorum.
मानवीय सहायता का समय से और निरंतर पहुंचना आवश्यक है। ये सुनिश्चित करना भी जरूरी है कि इजराइल और हमास की लड़ाई किसी तरह का क्षेत्रीय रूप धारण न कर ले। हम मानते हैं कि आतंकवाद हम सभी को अस्वीकार्य है। सिविलियंस की मौत कहीं भी हो निंदनीय। आज हुए हॉस्टेजेस के रिलीज के समाचार का हम स्वागत करते हैं। उम्मीद करते हैं कि सभी हॉस्टेजेस जल्दी रिहा हो जाएंगे।
The reality is this humanitarian pause is what Canada and others have been calling for weeks now. It is going to allow for hostages to finally be liberated. It's going to allow for significant amounts of humanitarian aid to get into the civilians and the innocent people in Gaza who desperately need it. And it's going to allow for protecting of civilian life, including hopefully getting even more Canadians and foreign nationals out. This is an important bit of progress, but we have to redouble our efforts now to get towards a lasting peace.
Понимаю, что эта война, гибель людей не может не потрясать. А кровавый переворот на Украине в 2014 году, за которым последовала война киевского режима против своего народа на Донбассе, это не потрясает. А истребление гражданского населения в Палестине, в секторе Газа сегодня, не потрясает. А то, что врачам приходится делать детям операции,
новостные операции, действовать скальпелем по детскому телу без наркоза, это не потрясает. А то, что генеральный секретарь Организации Объединенных Наций сказал, что Газа превратилась в огромное детское кладбище, это не потрясает.
Mr. Ambassador, it's good to see you. What do you make of Vladimir Putin's comments today and the reaction to his comments?
Well, Simone, you already highlighted two very important things that he said today that he usually doesn't say. He called the war a war. He didn't call it a special military operation in Ukraine. That's what he usually calls it. And he also labeled it a tragedy, as you pointed out. That's new. That's different. He was reacting, and he went off script. I watched the speech. He put his speech down, and then he went ad-lib when he was responding to those leaders that you just mentioned. It was irritating to him, just like you said. He had to listen to other people criticizing him, and he pushed back, and he played the whataboutism game, right? And in particular, what about Gaza? What about what's happening there? What about the Middle East? Not about what's happening in Ukraine, as a way to defray the criticism of himself.
You know, he brought up Gaza and what's happening in the Middle East, and it seems to me that he's hoping that the United States and also Ukraine's allies, Western allies, that they get distracted. From what I've seen, I don't think that is happening, at least not here in the United States just yet. But what about the other allies of Ukraine? Are folks getting slightly distracted?
Well, generally there's distraction because the counteroffensive in Ukraine didn't go as it hoped this fall. And so there's now lots of debate about what to do next. And that's exactly what Putin wants. He wants us to be debating it. He wants the U.S. Congress to delay military assistance. That's good news for Putin. And he wants us to just talk about the war in the Middle East and not talk about his war. That's all good news for him. And by the way, Simone, your last piece is also good news for him. When we're talking about the disasters that might happen to American democracy, that's what he's waiting for as well. And in particular, I think it's very clear now that Putin will not negotiate until he knows who the next president of the United States will be, because he feels, I think quite rightly, by the way, I think it's rational on his part, that he could get a better deal if Mr. Trump was the president of the United States.
But is President Zelensky of Ukraine even in the position where he is talking about negotiating with Vladimir Putin? You know, I've talked to a number of parliament members in Ukraine who say they will accept nothing less than full sovereignty. And full sovereignty means all of their territory, Crimea, the Donbass, everything.
Well, you're absolutely right. Number one, President Zelensky shares that view. I saw him in September in Kiev, and he made that very clear. Number two, Ukraine is a democracy. It's not a dictatorship like Russia. And the vast, overwhelming majority, 90%, I think, by the last poll that I saw, supports exactly what you just outlined. So even if Zelensky thought that it was time to negotiate, he can't do that because his people don't want him to. But I want to underscore a very important thing, because a lot of Americans, a lot of Europeans are giving Zelensky advice about how he should negotiate. Lots of people telling him what he should do. Nobody is telling Putin what he should do. And if Putin doesn't want to negotiate, it doesn't matter what you tell Zelensky, there will be no negotiations.
I guess my last question for you, Mr. Ambassador, is who could exert that influence over President Putin? Is it President Xi Jinping of China? And is there a willingness to do that even?
Well, certainly the Ukrainians think that it's Xi Jinping. They've been trying to court relations with the Chinese for several months now. They think that she's the only person that could do that. But their calculus is until our presidential elections are over, there's no opportunity for negotiations. What happens after that, maybe that's when Xi Jinping or even the United States president could play a role. But before then, Putin's locked in. He's not going to negotiate, and we just should accept that as a fact.
Thousands of people gathered on Parliament Hill today for a pro-Palestinian rally. The group calling for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. CTV's Natalie Van Roy was there.
Thousands of people from across Ontario convening on Parliament Hill to have their voices heard.
So we are here today in a historic march in support of the Palestinian people.
The rally, the largest yet in the nation's capital since the October 7th Hamas attack. For those here, it's a conflict that hits close to home.
My dad did have to grow up in a refugee camp. He went through a civil war. My grandparents had to run away from a war. And it's just, it's not great to see this kind of generational trauma.
As some wait for updates from family in Gaza.
We suspect that they're either, unable to reach any type of communication, or that they're under the rubble.
The rally calling for a permanent ceasefire.
We are here to call for a genuine ceasefire, so not a pause, but a genuine ceasefire.
Organizers say that buses transported people from right across Ontario to be here at the rally, including from Toronto, Mississauga, and the Kitchener-Waterloo area.
It was very exciting. Everybody's really excited to be here to stand up for Palestinians and to take this to the heart of the Canadian beast.
In attendance, Ontario MPP Sarah Jama, who was ejected from the NDP caucus after a social media statement on X, formerly Twitter, where she expressed support for the Palestinian people and called for an end to the occupation of Palestinian land.
I'm here today in support of the many Palestinians who are organizing to continue to put pressure on this government to call for a ceasefire.
As well as Tarek Lubani, a prominent London, Ontario doctor who was arrested on a charge of mischief following an incident last month where the Crown in the case said police observed Lubani pull out a bottle of ketchup and squirt it on the exterior of an MP's building following a protest. Lubani said he was a doctor in Gaza and is in touch with the hospital there.
They don't have the basic competencies of medical care, like water, like soap, like anesthetic.
After the rally at Parliament Hill, the group marched through the streets of downtown Ottawa. Natalie Van Roy, CTV News, Ottawa.
The important point there is, of course, Milei is attacking socialism. He's come hard out against socialism in all its form. Argentina, if the history of Argentina scares you, well, that is the prospective future for Australia. A resource-rich country that takes its own wealth for granted, and then as Dick.
Remember space and legroom?
Into socialist, quasi-socialist, progressive politics to the point where you need a Milei to come out and go, no, he's got a chainsaw which he goes around and he's going to dismantle the bureaucracy with. That's where we are going in Australia unless we get Peter Dutton into the lodge at the next election. The socialists are destroying this country as surely as they've destroyed Argentina and as surely as they've been destroying the Netherlands. And this week we had another fantastic win for Conservatives. Finally, you'll remember Geert by C. Wilders, Geert Wilders, Geert, however you want to pronounce it. He's been around forever. In Dutch politics, he's finally won. Let's talk to Ralph Schulhammer about it. Ralph, always great to see you. We always go to you for what's happening in the Netherlands. This is terrific news. Tell us about it.
Well, I mean, Lenin supposedly once said there are decades where nothing happens and then there are weeks where decades happen. And I think this is a little bit what we have experienced over the last couple of weeks. I mean, if you look at the polls in the Netherlands just 4 weeks ago, I mean, it was to be close, but it was not supposed to be a win of Wilders to that extent. I mean, basically 1 in 4 Dutch people voted for the party for freedom, for Wilders' party. That is, for Dutch conditions, basically a landslide, given the fact that pretty much everybody who wants to have a party in the Dutch parliament can have a party in the Dutch parliament. But this is quite the victory. Now, what we have to say, of course, is whether he will pull off becoming prime minister. that's going to be difficult because, as the new Argentinian president correctly pointed out already, the media, the left wing, the kind of the cartel between the media, the cultural, the artistic, and the politics, they're going to do everything they can to prevent Wilders from becoming prime minister. So these cultural fights that Millet is talking about is just about to begin. Now, I think the chances for the right to win it are better than they have ever been. But this is not as Churchill once said, this is not the beginning of the end, it's the end of the beginning, and the real fight is starting now.
James.
Well, so one of the things I'm fascinated about looking at the results is that younger voters came out in force for Wilders here and his party. One of the things that we're told in Australia repeatedly is that conservatism and the right is a dying ideology and that the young are all on the left. What is it about Wilders and his party that's so attractive, and what have the mainstream doing so wrong to get young voters offside?
Well, I think the two things we have to look at. I mean, Wilders did particularly well with young people, and did also particularly well outside the urban areas. So this is also applies to young people. They did very well with young people who did not live in the urban areas. For example, in Amsterdam, they got barely, they didn't even get 10%, whereas the left coalition got 29%. So this is another divide that's going to happen in Europe as well and other parts, is the rural-urban divide. So a little bit what you see happening, not just in the Netherlands, is I say, many people make this idiotic comparison, like The Guardian and others, this is like the 1920s and the 1930s and fascism is going to return. This is all nonsense. Neither Millet nor Wilders, nor Le Pen, nor Meloni, none of them are fascists. It's more like the 1840s. You have a situation in Europe that's in many ways pre-revolutionary, but the difference to what happened about 150 years ago is back then, right, you had the urban centers kind of spreading out the ideology into the rural areas. I think what we are now seeing, it's the other way around. The conservative rural areas are starting to trickle into the urban centers, and I think this is going to be very interesting. But it's very difficult to say what's going to happen beyond the...
As tensions continue to escalate in the Middle East, many people are saying it's a binary conflict between good and evil, although good and evil changes depending on who you...
Geert Wilders has told the Dutch...
Organic yogurt is a delicious choice crafted with care. We only use organic milk from happy grass-fed cows with no GMOs. Because we love cows as much as Maya. See? Hang in there, little guy. Olympic Organic Yogurt, where a little care makes a lot of good.
This is Ramallah, where obviously large crowds are waiting for the return of 39 all men, some of them teenagers, who've been held in Israeli detention, who are being released as part of this exchange. Emotions clearly running high. We can go to Nida Ibrahim, who's there in Ramallah. Nida, talk us through what we're seeing and hearing.
We've just seen Palestinians marching and carrying one prisoner, freed prisoner, on their shoulders, and they made their way into the square. But now we are waiting for what we believe is the bus that is carrying some of those 39 Palestinians who have been released. Remember, some of them have already been released to Jerusalem, and the rest are going to be making their way to the occupied West Banks and Arafat Square. As you can see, it's a scene that is emotional, that is filled with feelings of victory amongst many Palestinians, but it's not short on anyone to say that they remember the sacrifices that are taking place in Gaza, not just the killings, not just the injury, not just the bombing of homes, but the displacement of Palestinians outside of their homes. This is a fear many Palestinians have, that Israel has been systematically kicking Palestinians out of their homes in the north of Gaza, and then it's gonna corner them in the south later on to kind of push them away outside of the besieged Gaza Strip. We are seeing, because of this traffic that we've been seeing. Also yesterday, the buses took a while to be able to get to the final destination that's planned for the main, let's call it a celebration. But we're seeing more movement, we're seeing more Palestinians. It could be, and I'm not sure, it could be that, if you can zoom in a little bit, Zakaria, that they've released some of those prisoners from the buses. They've let them off of the buses, and then they're gonna make their way here in like a protest form with Palestinians carrying the freed prisoners with them. Again, it's a situation that is unfolding as we are looking, but we are seeing flags, we are seeing cars carrying Palestinian flags. We've seen mostly Fatah flags here today, unlike the other days
we can see on our screens the images that you are talking about, and we can see now the bus arriving into the square or area where you are not that far away from that exchange happening, of course, under the auspices of the International Red Cross. Give us a sense of who is on board, who is involved in being released from Israeli jails. We know 39, we know many of them, or all of them are male. Anything else?
Yeah, we know that 3 female prisoners whose names have made it to the list that Israel published of potential Palestinians who are going to be released. But the Palestinian female prisoners have been, 30 of them have been released. So we have 3 left from the list. We have other women, of course, but most of those have been detained after October the 7th. We just spoke to a father, Mahmoud Hawakti from Bethlehem. He was telling us that his son had a year and a half left on his already 1 year and a half sentence, but now he's here to receive him earlier than planned. We've also heard the father, Abdullah Maw'id, telling us passionately, really, and emotionally about his son, a 17-year-old who's been behind bars for 6 months. And we've been hearing very difficult testimonies from Palestinians who have been released after October 7th, and they were saying not only has it been mistreatment, not only has it been a revenge by the Israeli forces against those prisoners. We've also heard from women saying that they couldn't get even their basic needs that they've used to get them and buy them. So you can imagine the tension. They've also have been cut off from the rest of the world because, you have to remember that those Palestinian prisoners have been in and out, when we talk about the general population, since 1967 in Israeli jails. Sometimes you'd see them waving and starting a wave of protests to achieve certain demands. And the fact that some prisoners have TVs inside the prison that they can watch and see certain channels, not everything, but they can watch the news. This has been considered an achievement by the prisoners' movement that only have been able to happen because they've led a lot of protests inside prison, including hunger strikes, collective hunger strikes. So for Palestinians, they believe that those are achievements that they've gotten now that they've been taken away from Palestinians post-October 7th. And just another point to add, when we talk to human rights organizations, they tell us that the conviction rate in Israeli prisons is very, very high, amounting to 97% or more. So what happens with these Palestinians? To avoid long trials, they accept the plea deal, even if it's not what Israel accuses them of doing. So they'll say, you threw rocks against Israeli forces, so you can either stay in lengthy courts, or you could be detained. For a shorter period and pay a fine So Palestinians choose the later. Why? Because it saves them a little bit of prison time.
Nina, we will come back to you to cover these unfolding events there in Ramallah.
C'est une façon de vivre. KCH, c'est le meilleur pour travailler.
Let's bring in Katie McFarland. She's the former Deputy National Security Advisor. Katie, all these beautiful, welcome, first of all, and happy Thanksgiving to you. Hope you had a wonderful time with your family. These images are heartwarming. They do bring